Hello, David. Great to catch up with you online and for you letting us explore a little bit about your life story. Before we kick off, would you like to just give a brief introduction, if that's possible, just to who you are, maybe a little about your involvement in politics, just high level before we delve into anything deep, and just whatever you feel is appropriate, just to give a flavor.
Well, hi, Lloyd. It's a real privilege for me to be able to interact with you. I'm Zimbabwean. I was born in Gweru way back in 1957, just after the Rinderpest. I moved with my parents to Bulawayo in 1961. I was educated in Bulawayo. As happened to most white Zimbabweans, I had to do my national service during the 1970s, and I then went to the University of Cape Town at the beginning of 1978 to do a law degree. And two very significant things happened there. In 1981, I came to faith in Lord Jesus through the persistence of three wonderful Christian brothers of mine who played rugby with me and were in my law class and literally persisted with me through 3 years of our undergraduate degree, and finally in my fourth year, one of them persuaded to become a Bible study. That Bible study on Romans, I came to faith. So that was the first thing. And in that Bible study, held as a consequence of that Bible study, I met my wife, Jenny. So those were pivotal moments in my life in 1981. We graduated, returned to Zimbabwe in 1982, married early 1983. I joined a law firm, which I'm still part of. I'm the partner of the law firm. But in 1999, I was asked by Morgan Tsvangirai to come in as the founding legal secretary of the MDC, and I've been part of the since. For my many sins, elected Treasurer General of the MDC in 2019, in that position I still. I'm a father of 4 children, and I'm mother very proudly of 5 grandchildren and another one due in December. So very blessing to us.
Oh, fantastic! That's a wonderful background you've given, and it's great to be part of a family, an ever-growing family, believing family. So thanks for that. Can you just take us back to maybe when you first started off your professional career, your career in the legal profession? How did you get involved in that, and you progressed to become the senior partner of a law firm? Just tell us how that happened and what lessons you learned during that time, and what your philosophy of doing business is.
So I joined the firm I'm still with, Wedlow & Barry, which is one of the law firms in Zimbabwe, set up in 1897. I joined it at the beginning of 1983, right at the time when the Gukurahundi started this terrible chapter in Zimbabwe's history, where Mugabe deployed his North Korean trained 5th Brigade into the areas surrounding Bulawayo, where the law firm is situated. And literally within a few weeks of starting as a junior lawyer, I was absorbed, thrust into this vortex. I ended up representing many victims and people like Joshua Nkomo, the nationalist leader, and many members of his central committee who had previously been representing lawyers who were threatened. And as literally a lawyer out of university, I ended up representing them. I always had an interest in human rights, and that fed that interest. The Old Testament is replete with injunctions for us to strive to honor God's standards of justice. Isaiah 58 has always been a very pivotal chapter in my life, that we should be striving to achieve a true fast in any nation, and that includes lifting yokes, breaking chains. And so my law profession has always been founded on those principles. Used my position to start the first legal aid clinic in Bulawayo in 1986. I was still obviously in my law firm. And then we set up something called the Bulawayo Legal Project Center. I became a trustee of its parent organization, the Legal Resources Foundation, and was its founding director for 10 years. It remains one of the preeminent human rights organizations in the country. Its focus is on providing legal services to people who can't afford lawyers. And of course, I've had to juggle both my legal practice and being a politician since 1999. I've remained in the law firm throughout. The only period I took leave of absence from the law firm was when I became Minister of Education, Sport, Arts and Culture during the period of the inclusive government between 2009 and 2013. My partners, as I say, gave me leave of absence. I left the law firm effectively. I kept my shares in the law firm. And then they gave me further leave of absence after that, after my tenure ended in 2013. I wanted to write a book, which I did, which was published in 2016. And once I'd finished writing the book in October 2015, I came back into my role as senior partner, which I continue to this day. I still have to juggle. I do a lot of arbitration and mediation work these days. I don't appear in court for reasons we can delve into if you're interested and we have time. But I do arbitration and mediation. I do a bit of family law, but also, I've still got my responsibilities in the church, and of course the very heavy responsibility of being Treasurer General of the MDC. One other thing I should mention is that I've always been keenly interested in education. I put forward the proposal way back in 1986 to our church to set up a Christian school, which has become a reality. All my children have been educated through it, and my first grandchild starts at that school. It's called Petra College in Bulawayo, and it's something that the Lord has blessed abundantly for the wider community, but also for my own family. So you'll see that I'm a lawyer, but I have quite a few balls that I have up in the air at any one time.
That's amazing. It's incredible how you've managed to juggle all those and keep them going, and seeing all these different areas of life flourish. I just wanted to explore a little bit about your role in politics and how you decide on whether to get involved in something, whether to say something, or whether to just stand back and let others take part. So you could just give us a little bit of your thinking each time you come to a situation, be it something as large as the genocide that you witnessed and had to work in, to something local in your neighborhood. I don't know. How do you look at these things as a Christian leader?
So let me start with the broadest possible perspective at the outset, and that is to say that the church as an institution should never be involved in institutional politics. And that goes back to Jesus being challenged with the coin and saying, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And that really sets the principle for me. The church as an institution should never be involved in partisan politics. However, the church as a broad institution has to play its role in upholding God's standards of justice. And the prophets, prophets like Amos and others are very clear on that the church cannot remain silent. And there are many examples of Christian leaders down through the ages who have stood up in the promotion of God's standards of justice. And so whilst the church cannot get involved in partisan politics, it has an obligation to uphold God's standards of justice. And individual Christians have that equal obligation to uphold God's standards of justice, whether they get involved in politics or not, partisan politics or not. Christians cannot turn a blind eye to obvious injustices taking place before their very eyes. It is part of being salt and light in our community. We are called, every single Christian is called to be salt and light in the community they operate in. And that means that we've got to flavor and to corrupt deadened meat, to preserve that meat, which is society. And we need to be the candle, the candlelight in darkness. And that applies to all of us without exception. Moving down the step, there are some Christians who are called to be involved in partisan politics. Not everyone is called to be involved in partisan politics, but each one of us are given particular talents by God, and both the scriptures and the experience of the last 2,000 years of Christianity shows that part of being salt and light is getting involved in secular political parties, to be salt and light in those political parties. I've always had an interest. God has given me an interest in human rights, but also in politics. Not everyone has that interest, but I can say that I was given that interest. And so, although I didn't seek the position in 1999, I didn't go out to get involved in the ND. When Morgan Tsvangirai approached me, I view it as I do all things that are brought into our lap through a sovereign, all-powerful God. And because it was not something that I initiated, I took it seriously. It came from a very serious individual, Morgan Tsvangirai. And Jenny and my wife Jenny and I prayed through. We sought the counsel of our local church leadership, and the local church leadership was that I needed to get involved. The country was in crisis at the time. And since then, I have to say that through many trials, troubles, because my involvement in politics has invoked the wrath of the tyranny which governs Zimbabwe and has done since 1980, and before, let me say that. Despite having invoked that wrath, the Lord has not just protected us through this period, but blessed us abundantly. As we reflect on the last, as we can see how the Lord has been with us every step of the way, even in the darkest days when, our lives, or my life in particular, when they sought to detain us, or detain me in particular, the Lord has protected through our children. Thank God, all know the Lord, love the Lord, and have been educated and are now building their own lives. And so I can say with absolute confidence that going into politics was clearly the Lord, and at present remains the Lord's will. But it's not what everyone is called to. The body of Christ is made up of many different parts, all of which must interact with each other. And I respect, Christian leaders who say, I'm not interested. Some of my own children are not interested in politics, but they have a deep faith. And I respect that position because they're called to something different to me.
That's incredible. No, thanks for that. just talking about the times when you had persecution, just help us to see how, being a Christian, being a politician, but also being able to love your enemies. How do you love your enemy when they just keep coming back for more and attacking you? How has your heart been over the last 20, 30, 40 years dealing with your enemies, and then even going into government, in a government of national unity with your enemies? And how did you work through all that?
So just to give you more background, I've been subjected to 4 assassination attempts on my life. Some were pretty amateur. One in particular was very well planned. I've been detained on serious charges. I've been threatened with detention as recently as this past January. And so, I've had those threats for decades. It has caused often serious inconvenience to my family. Our home has been raided by the police. For example, our eldest daughter, when she was 14, had her bedroom raided, and much to her annoyance. And our children, particularly when they were young, were frightened by the prospect of armed men outside our gate, and threats being made against their father, and on a couple of occasions their mother. So there's a lot that has happened to us that would cause us to feel deep-rooted anger and bitterness. But I have to say that the Lord's been very gracious to us, because He has removed that anger and removed that bitterness. Successively, and over a long period of time. Let me use my example with my relationship with Mugabe as an example. Way back in 1999, Mugabe went on national television and said that I was an enemy of the state. And he was president through all 4 of the assassination attempts on me. And yet I came into cabinet with him as president and chairing cabinet. I realized to my surprise, because I expected to be bitter and angry towards him, that the Lord had actually removed that from my heart. And although I'm not by any means an apostle for Robert Mugabe, I was given insight into him, in his background, and insight into some of the reasons why he did in the way he did. And the remarkable thing, it's a miracle really, is that within about a year of being Minister of Education, I actually had a very functional relationship with Mugabe when it came to educational matters. We disagreed on other matters fiercely, but when it came to education and interests of children, I got on really well with Mugabe, and he backed me cabinet and elsewhere at every turn. And so that also helped in that healing process. One of my favorite scriptures, Lloyd, is found in Philippians 4. Don't be anxious about anything, but in all things through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to the Lord, and the peace of God, which surpasses all human understanding, will guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. And that has been a persistent prayer of mine when I'm anxious about anything or recognized anger or bitterness creeping in, and recognize that I don't have the ability myself to deal with it. I prayed that prayer. I said, Lord, you promised this in Philippians 4, in this very fine peace of Scripture, that you will give me your peace that no one else can explain. It's inexplicable in human terms, and critically that it guards your heart, and that the anxiety, the stress that goes with perhaps that anger or that bitterness is removed and replaced. Remarkable peace, and I really feel for people around me who don't know peace, don't know how they cope with life, but I know that it's been a very real peace in my life, and has enabled me to the people who, in many respects, I shouldn't even be giving the time of day to. But I come back to this notion, salt and light. The Lord has called us to be salt and light in communities, and part of that being salt and light, you don't forget about the evil that they've done to, not just to me, but in fact, more importantly, to many poor people in this country. You don't forget about that. You must not forget about it. You must also not seize the opportunities the Lord gives you to challenge them. But you are so much more effective if you deal with those issues without a trace of anger or bitterness. People are far more receptive to what you say if it comes from that having forgiven them and being at peace with yourself, with your Maker, and with them.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, most of the people in the business link community that I deal with they're business people. They don't have to deal with political enemies, but they've probably got people in their companies or maybe competitors who they maybe need to forgive and work with. So thanks for that wonderful advice. That's beautiful. Just exploring a little bit about your role in the church, because I know you're a leader in the church. You sometimes preach. Just tell us a little bit about that and how you balance that with, maybe another, public role, being a politician. How do you, be salt and light in the church as well?
So let me tell you that one of the problems of going into partisan politics is that it does make your Christian ministry more problematic, because people both within the church and even outside the church primarily view you as a Christian. I beg your pardon. No, they don't. They primarily view you as a politician, not as a Christian. And so even when you come to preach, it undermines, there's no doubt it undermines a ministry like that, because people will assume that you're then interpreting Scripture from a partisan perspective and using the opportunity to preach as an opportunity to promote a partisan agenda. And I have found that a problem. I have found that, for example, in the 1980s and 90s, I used to get a lot more invitations to preach than I do now. I'm really invited to preach now, and I think it's because churches, and I understand it, understand why they have that reservation. They are worried that if they invite me to preach, their church will be associated with a partisan political organization. But I haven't really answered your question in terms of my involvement. I remain an elder of our Presbyterian church. I've been with the Presbyterian church most of my life. And I do preach occasionally within our own church. We are blessed with a particularly fine teacher and pastor. And so quite frankly, I'm very happy to sit under his preaching every week because I learn so much from him. And quite frankly, our congregation get a second, third, or fourth list if I'm the one who has to go and preach compared to him. So I'm comfortable in that arrangement. I am involved in an array of sort of other Christian activities. I'm on the board of the Theological College of Zimbabwe. And as I mentioned earlier, I put forward the idea of setting up a Christian school in Bulawayo. And that original idea has been blessed by the Lord, and it's now one of the preeminent schools in the country. It goes from grade 0 right the way through to upper 6. It has in both junior and senior schools about 1,000 kids. And I've been chair of the trust for decades, in fact, far too long, and I'm just about to stand down from the trust in November this year, having been involved in the trust that runs the school since 1986. And that has been a source of great blessing to me, just to see how the Lord has built the school through very difficult economic conditions, through hyperinflation, 2 bouts of hyperinflation, through many people emigrating from the country, through political strife, and just to see how the Lord's purposes have been achieved despite our frailty, despite everything going on in the country, has been a great encouragement to me in my faith. And it's been a very important component of my own Christian ministry in the city and in the nation. The school is, I believe, and I'm obviously biased, but I think it has been a very powerful witness in our society here in Bulawayo and in the country generally. And then inevitably, as a Christian, I get called into a range of issues concerning churches. I've been involved in the mediation of disputes or disputes have involved Christian churches. So that is pretty much my
thanks. That's fantastic, David.
In the church.
Yeah. So just wrapping up now, I'd love it if you could maybe just give 1 or 2 sentences to maybe a young Christian starting off in A, politics, B, maybe some sort of work arena, maybe a partnership like you, going to the legal profession, and maybe C, just a young Christian who's thinking of, social action or, community transformation like you've done with the schools and everything in Bulawayo. So maybe just a sentence for each of those 3 categories as we close off.
Yeah, so first of all, a word for young Christians thinking of going into politics. The most important thing in my in the scriptures to ensure that you know them and that they remain your guide, and that you always put the scriptures before any partisan secular political manifesto, and let that be your foundation. And tied to that, you have to trust in the sovereignty of the Lord. The trouble with politicians is that we tend to manipulate. We try to get as much power through whatever means for ourselves. And in my experience, when I've done that, I've come short. When I've trusted in the Lord's means and timing and processes and method, I found, my path a lot smoother. And that means that on occasions, as has happened to me, there'll be times, following Ecclesiastes, there's a time for everything under the sun. And there are times when the Lord wants you to take a step back. I experienced that in 2013. I was Minister of Education in the country. I lost my seat by 19 votes. I accepted it at the time. I'd worked very hard, but I've had to accept it. And I've seen since that, that the Lord's taken me into down other avenues, which have been a great blessing to me. But one has to accept that, in the Lord's sovereign power, there are times when He is going to allow you to pursue a political path, and there are times when he says literally, take a step back. I'm the Lord. I will do it in my time and through my means. Secondly, to the young lawyer, in many ways, the advice is precisely the same. In law, you will find that there are often many demands on you that you will find compromise your faith. And if you're not rooted in the scriptures, you're going to compromise your faith and your Christian beliefs. And sometimes it's tough. You've got to oppose partners. You will be called to argue cases that you find incredibly difficult. But in my own experience, I have always judged the law in relation to the scriptures. And if laws run directly contrary to clear scriptural injunctions, then I've had no difficulty in arguing against those laws. Having said that, though, one has to bear in mind, other injunctions that we operate in a secular society, and we operate within secular judicial systems, and the Lord has placed those governments and those systems in place, and so one has an obligation to work within those systems where they are clearly running contrary to scriptural injunctions. Then one has a duty to argue, but always in a dignified way, and in a way that respects that we are ambassadors of Christ. There are many examples going down. I'm going back into politics a bit now, but often politics and law overlaps. Someone like Wilberforce, although his fight was against the slave trade in Parliament, there were laws in Britain that allowed the slave trade, and those laws needed to be changed. And his example is one that we should all follow in seeking to change unjust laws as lawyers. I forget the third one. Can you remind me of the third thing? The
third one was just young Christians heading out into life. Any other general points, maybe? Yeah.
So I suppose the general thing I would say, I turned 64 in a few months' time. I've been a Christian since 1981. And I think one of the greatest battles we have as Christians is to oppose certain aspects of the world we live in, the get-rich-quick syndrome, the notion that life always has to be smooth, that we must get all the luxuries around us as quickly as possible. The one thing that I have learned is that when the scriptures say rejoice in your trials because they're for your own benefit, that is correct. And we must expect those trials as Christians, irrespective of whether we're involved in politics or law or any other profession. Those trials are going to come. And those trials can manifest themselves in many different ways. They can manifest themselves in perhaps being jobless for a season, or not being paid sufficient, or having health problems. And they're really tough. I don't disregard those, but in my own experience, I know that I have been refined through the trials I and my family have had to deal with, and not just refined, being incredibly blessed. I found myself, these decades on from coming into faith, with a wonderful wife who remarkably still loves me, children and grandchildren, and a community of friends. And we've done this in Zimbabwe. since 1983 through, genocide, crimes against humanity, the second highest rates of hyperinflation in the world. And yet, as I reflect back, we've just been blessed. I often say to friends, my cup doesn't just spill over, it pours over. And so if that can happen to us in Zimbabwe, it can happen in Scotland and, in elsewhere, if we simply trust that the Lord will bring trials to us, but will take us through those trials and will refine us and in such a way that we actually become better people, closer to the Lord, and people who can interact better with people around us. There's so much suffering in the world. Look at what is happening in Afghanistan today. And one of the problems with television is that although it brings these events to our attention, we still remain remote from those things. And these things are happening today in Afghanistan, but they will happen throughout the world going forward. And we are better equipped to empathize with people, to deal with those issues, if we have experienced some trials ourselves. So that's my principal message to young Christians. It's not meant to be a pessimistic word. In fact, on the contrary, it's meant to encourage you to say, whilst you can expect these things, the Lord will bless you through those trials and make you stronger and better people.
Thank you so much, David. That's been a great privilege just to hear from you, to talk to you. Absolutely amazing. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thanks.